So thanks very much for the invitation to come. And I'm a Scot, if you recognise by my accent a little bit. But I've lived in the northeast of England for a good number of years now, and I think the instruction from Scotland these days is to say you're a Scot living in voluntary exile in England, because there's quite a divide happening, you know, in the UK in terms of Scots and their identity. But anyway, the northeast of England, and it's involved, like yourselves, in higher education, and try to keep one foot always in practice. And in these early days, then it was possible to argue that the university had three particular foundations: research, right, okay, teaching, and at that time when I started, public service. And it was really a notion that the university had that as a foundation. And those of us who entered the university were saying, well, we believe that the university should be a resource to the community of which it is part. And that was a commitment we had, whereas that has partly disappeared now, and it feels at worst points in England that people are a resource to the university, usually money-wise or whatever. So there's been that big change. So anyway, I still have an interest and enjoy the engagement coming to me, Powell, in different places, and trying to find ways that we can learn from each other. And we have a difficult scene in the UK with trying to divide us in terms of European attitudes. So that's a problem. But Anne, yourself.
Yeah, I'm Anne. I'm a community development consultant. I live sort of halfway up the country in a rural area on the east of the country that nobody will ever have heard of. And I was a community development worker. We were talking earlier. I ran a neighbourhood project for older people for 5 years, and then I worked as a church-based community development worker for 6. Done bits and pieces of research at universities, and now for the last 23 years I've done consultancy and specialise in 3 areas really. One is around sort of faith organisations, like as Jim does, work with community centres and community buildings and helping people to manage them and to manage them well, and work in rural areas and work around things like rural poverty and rural services. So those are 3 areas that I tend to specialise in, but have used asset-based community development, working with people in rural areas, and we've also used it with farming families who are suffering quite badly in England, as farming, I guess, gets the same as here, but gets very big and industrialised, and the small farming families are struggling. And I've worked in Poland before with Pavel, and when Pavel and his entourage have come to England as well, I've worked with them 3 times.
Thank you very much. Talking about rural areas and fostering the social life there, you reminded me another project in which Pavel, Center of Local Community Support from Warsaw, was conducting in 2012 and 14. This is a project of which 2, in my opinion, very valuable books were produced as well. Active biographies in the social space, and the portraits, topographies of social change on the base of the project Academy of Ecological Development. Ecologic development. So I'm very happy that, so to speak, university people were very much involved in this project, and also in these 2 books. pedagogues, people such as Dominik Miejski, my doctoral students, Marcin Boryczko, assistant professor at the Department of Social Pedagogy, and Dorota Jaworska, who is not present now, from the same department. However, it seems to me that even when we are so much involved in the city life, because we are here in the three cities metropolis, we have to think and have to work making really social change in rural areas as well. So this is one of the examples of doing this. I will pass these two books, just look at them. This is also something worthwhile to see, the newest volume of the magazine, animation of public life, animacja życia publicznego. In my opinion, it's also a very good example of animation good for current time of unsolved problems, social problems as well. So this is in Polish, so I don't pass this way. Newest, brand new number. So our seminar titled New Ways of Community Development is taught to think about this kind of development through new ways of education, university education of prospective social workers, community workers. We call them also social pedagogues at the University of Gdańsk. So we are very interested in what you will present in a minute. Because it would be a sort of most important inspiration for us to make this kind of education closer to community development. So please help us with doing this kind of change in education of university education of the community workers and other professions like this. We are the team of people involved in community work, community development as well. I think we all know each other or not. Olenko, ty może nie znasz wszystkich. No to przedstawmy się, słuchajcie.
Miejski Ośrodek Pomocy
Miejski
Społecznej.
Ośrodek Pomocy Społecznej Gdynia.
Jestem z Kierowskiej Inicjatywy Społecznej i Scala.
Dominik Krzymiński, jestem Dominik Krzymiński, I'm doctoral student here at the Social Pedagogy Department.
I'm Alexandra, I'm also a PhD candidate, and my dissertation would be about, when it's ready, about death education. I mean, participation in death rituals, how it educate towards death. And its research is done among silver generation, so people 50 plus, or mostly or only on rural spaces in Kaszubie here in northern Poland.
Rural areas.
I'm Ola. I'm work with the organization which was coordinator the project of the community work in one of the neighborhood in Gdynia. We meet before, and also I have some workshop here in university with students about the community work.
Hopefully you will do much more in nearest future, hopefully so.
Jarek Józefczyk, Municipal Social Welfare Center in Gdynia.
Yes, social welfare. I have to remember.
Yes, I'm vice director of this institution.
and also the member of the board of social work as the major here in the University of Gdańsk. So we are very happy having a possibility to consult all the decisions concerning this major university.
I've been already introduced by Professor Mendel. I'm assistant professor, so-called, but I'm not. In reality, I'm not a professor. I'm PhD, and I'm a member of social pedagogy department.
Yes, we call it Department of Social Pedagogy at the Institute of Education. Marcin is our expert, so to speak, of radical social pedagogy. So recently, even yesterday, I've read your absolutely fantastic writings in your blog. Marcin is a blogger who is systematically writing about radical social work, social pedagogy as well. It's very good, very not aggressive, but very dynamic. I like it very much. So I'm Maria Mendel. I'm trying to be a person who is able to foster this social energy at the university and also in its vicinity, in its milieu. That's the reason why I'm late today. I'm so sorry again. However, it seems to me that my role as such animator here is never-endingly to link non-governmental organizations, local authorities, university people, and just regular people living in the city and its vicinity. So that's social pedagogy. So can we start? Thank you very much. So please start your presentation, and it will be starting point of discussion as well.
So anyway, again, just say thanks very much for coming, and it's good for us to be here and have the chance to engage in some dialogue with you. I know that Marcin is keen to use some of the presentation as far as formal teaching is concerned, so we'll help him in that process by trying to keep to a little bit of the text. But you see in the title that this notion of liberating local knowledge and expertise, and this is an aspect that we were discussing a little bit this morning as when we're thinking of the work of the social work department in Rodzinie. And just to mention here, and I'll leave this material behind, we have really quite a difficult social context in the UK with decreasing amount of public services, nearly a sanctions culture, and some people see nearly an attack on poor people in many ways by the government. And a little bit of research which was part of the management of the project, looking at people's access to food, fuel and finance. How did people survive? And we heard this morning in terms of benefits here that it's very difficult for people to survive on the level of benefits. And for those within the academic institution, the interest of this piece of work is that the people who had the evidence were really people who were experiencing the problem. So the gathering of evidence for this report was actually done through focus groups in the community of people who didn't have access to food, fuel and finance. And of course that has raised many issues as to whether in itself food and fuel should be, in a sense, human rights rather than something that you have to buy in the marketplace. So that raises really some big challenges to things. But anyway, I'll leave this behind, and it was interesting at the end of this piece of work that one of the things that people did mention was another F, which people find strange, was people's access to funerals. That the number of cases in the UK where people can't even afford to head to their own funerals, causing all kinds of anxieties and pressures. And this was another particular aspect of people's distress at ending up with what was called a pauper's funeral, and that. So it was interesting, and that's when the report came out, was a bit of a challenge to people that, goodness, we had a society that's not even allowing that bit of dignity for people. So you might find that of interest. But again, the important part was to gather the evidence from people who were experiencing the problem in a very direct way. They were the experts, they had the knowledge. And linked to that, I'll leave this behind, it's a process that's been adopted in Scotland of having what's called a Poverty Truth Commission. So this is a commission that's 50% made up of people who are living in poor areas, with the directors talking about the issues and educating each other. So again, recognizing the local knowledge and the expertise. And this, in a sense, is gaining quite a lot of momentum in Scotland as a process. And their strapline, so to speak, is nothing about us without us is for us. It's quite an interesting strapline. Nothing about us without us is for us. That has huge implications for how we go about our business. And I'll say a little bit about another project that was involved in trying to unearth hidden assets, and how do we do that. So that's very close to the theme of the session, but I'll leave these behind, and all of these are available electronically if you wanted to, to put them where people can get access. So I suppose the question for us is as to whether some of these new ways are new ways for yourselves, and we probably think not. People here are well experienced in community development work, and it may well be that some of these ideas have been here already. But it's important when we adopt a title like this to try and see the themes that are there, and what are the kind of challenges of a changing Europe, which is quite a significant, important aspect for us, and how do we make sense of these transitions and these changes, and how do we help local communities or students understand these, and say a bit about that and try and frame that in a way that might be helpful and make sense. And then having a look at how one might focus on community assets and what are the characteristics of an asset-based approach, and I'll speak a little bit to that. And then focusing on what are the challenges to the public bodies and to the universities and to the universities effectively. So how do we make sense of a dynamic and changing world? And we're in communities that themselves are experiencing a huge amount of social transition, and marginalization and social exclusion from our experiences is increasing. And we know across Europe that the divide between the rich and the less rich is going this way rather than that way. Inequalities is quite common. Discrimination is there, worklessness and absence of employment opportunities, and I've learned this morning that varies quite a bit from Gdynia, where it's something like 4%. Some parts of Poland is 38%. So huge differentials, and same is the case in England. Some areas are okay. If you come to the northeast of England, where I live and work, then unemployment is very high. And so the changing role of the family in response to these social circumstances, issues of identity and social formation, and some of the political aspects which we mentioned a few minutes. We have a new tax in England called bedroom tax, and the state decides how many rooms you should have. And if you have too many, then your benefits will only be paid for the rooms that you need.
But only if you're poor.
Not that the name is in it.
It's only if you're poor.
Only if you're poor. Yeah, only if you're poor. So in some respects, in parts that I'm involved, then it affects something like 700 families are affected by the bedroom tax. And if you think of that we don't have smaller houses for people to move to, because society didn't build small houses. But from an identity and social formation point of view, the very process of the taxation is very disruptive of communities who have made friends, who have grown up with people, and you might be forced to move to another area where you have no friends. So it's not a very sensible policy. So self-interest, social responsibility. I think Pope Francis, I know Poland a good Catholic country, I think Pope Francis calls it the globalization of indifference. Quite a challenging thing. He talks about that society is really quite indifferent to each other. Self-interest is there, and that's how he, interestingly, talks about that and the faces and the facets of oppression that are there. And expressions of fear and suspicion. And this fear and suspicion is currently quite substantial in England in relation to migrants and every other group that might, in a sense, be seen as the enemy, and not least in relation to extremism, which is very, very acute in England at present. So quite a lot of social transition. And the political transition, there's models of welfare and social welfare provision changing hugely. Welfare to workfare, and we are now experiencing a serious structure of sanctions on people, that if you don't turn up for your appointment at the labour exchange, then you would lose your benefit. And there's enough evidence that officers who work there have got targets to meet how many people they will trip up. So a culture of sanctions is not very helpful. And ambiguities of accountability and confidence in these structures. Some of the demographic transition, I think probably the same as here, an increasingly aging population, something that's of interest to our colleagues here. Gender restructuring and reordering of traditional roles in the families, and I think we learned this morning again that some communities it could be as high as 70% of children growing up in single-parent families. So again, huge shift of how we address this. And the economic transition is very, very important. And this evidence from access to food, fuel and finance really highlights hugely the economic transition experienced by people. And some of these aspects in this whole section are really quite difficult to engage with and discuss within the England context. They're a little bit, if not easier to deal with, at least easier to discuss in the the Scottish context. That's quite important, and we have this massive shift that's likely to happen at the next general election in England, where a complete political shift, and no one can speculate as to what is likely to come out. I think it's possible to argue within that Scottish context that people are trying to see the changes, and university people understand perhaps the language through the lens of the poor. How possible is it for us to judge society and what's happening in it through the lens of the poor? And it's very difficult to, in a sense, researchers don't traditionally see things through the lens of poor people. And in the Scottish context, that seems to a little bit easier than it is in the England context, where we most of the time are blaming the poor for the problem. We wouldn't have the debts if we didn't have the poor. That kind of attitude. And there's been an attempt to buy political votes, in my view, by the kind of resources that are made to older people who have some money in England, by offering a high interest rates. They call it kind of granny bonds. So the government's offering bonds with a high interest rate to older people. The Chancellor has just raised £5 billion in the last 3 months of these kind of bonds. So there's money in the community. It's not as if that's everybody short of money. It's that interest in how do we share it, how do we use it, and how do we restructure it. So this transition thing is quite important to get a grasp of. And some of the literature in the leaders in the press have taken a slant, which is interesting, that old people are being supported at the expense of young people, and that's really quite an important issue to what that feels like in terms of Poland. What are the implications for community development that old people are they have a strong political vote. That's why the government's behaving as it does. But I think we're sitting currently at something like £20 million, 20 million people unemployed, young people in Europe. So we have these 2 columns here, and we're interested as to how you perceive these and how you see these, because they actually provide a bit of a foundation upon which to think of perhaps different ways or new ways of working. And on the left-hand side, you have this deficit approach, that we look out there and we see problems in the community. Everything is a problem. Starts with deficiencies, problems defined by external data about the community. So that can be influenced by the media, can be influenced by reality, and most of the policies are about services provided to meet these needs. And the emphasis on the role of the agencies and the providers. And here I might be making a political point, but it's possible to argue, we can discuss it, whether it's the same in Poland, that services in England at present are designed for the benefit of the providers rather than those who need them. Now that's a bit of a challenge, that the services, because of the privatization of services and the commodification of services, the people who benefit most are those actually that provide them rather than those who need them. So it's quite a complex art there. The focus is on individuals, families. Doesn't focus on factors and forces externally that may be undermining their personal resilience. And we touched that a little bit this morning. What are the things that keep you and I resilient? What are the things that enhance our resilience as people? What are the things that undermine our resilience, make it difficult to survive? And there's an interesting example in earlier times in Poland against the earlier regimes. I think someone described it this morning as well. There was an enemy there, so you're very resilient against the enemy, in a sense. So who's the enemy in present day? You know, it's quite an important issue for thinking in terms of an analysis. Do we see people as clients and consumers of services? To treat people as passive and done to? Help people with problems, implement programs as the answer. So you see the notion of a deficit approach, that we see it, the gloomy side, the more difficult side. We think of the asset-based approach, which starts with the actual potential assets in a community. How does that happen? What do we mean by assets? And how do we identify the opportunities and the strengths? And this particular project, we started off by thinking, how did we discover the hidden assets? And realized as we spoke to local people, they were saying that over a period of 40 years, they had been subject to about half a dozen municipal or government policies. And every time the professionals arrived, they restructured the agenda. They never, very rarely asked local people what were the assets that they had. So you come out with a notion for the society. Does it fit people around services, or does it develop services around people? Quite a challenging kind of view. Do you build services around people? So therefore, if we see or look for the things that undermine the resilience, how do we address these? How do we challenge these? How do we look at these? And how do we build services that nurture the strengths in the community? And I suppose philosophically, there it aims to invest in people as citizens, emphasize the role of civil society to recognize social capital. And how does that work? Sees people as active citizens, enable people to take control of their lives. Is that where we're at? Is that how it works? And if you just move us on. Sorry. I don't know whether you met this model before, but it attempts to just help us to navigate a community and neighbourhood context. And you can see the factors at work there, the stakeholders who might be in there through agencies. Is that how we see it? Do we find ourselves locked into one of these boxes and working like this most of the time? Does the university teach people into these boxes? Is that the way that it works? And in a university context earlier, just last week, and we were struggling to define whether the university had a moral and ethical base to most of the teaching that it did. And was there such a thing as a moral economy? And some of us concluded that perhaps every degree program in a university should have a module that was about moral and ethical issues rather than invested interest issues. So quite a few problems which is having a look at this and see how it might connect raises. So that's a little bit of the complexity of the scene conceptually through looking at transitions, trying to see this picture of what this might mean. Nan's going to take us into a little bit.
Can I swap over so I can see?
Yeah.
May I ask you something? I have a question regarding this shift, this movement from deficit approach to asset-based approaches. This second one, the asset-based approaches. Do you think there are some connection to the European Union, to the Commission's policies, especially, I mean, recommendations published in 2014, it was spring 2014 or 13 even, but quite new European Union social policy called SIP, Social Investment Package. There are a lot of talking about investing in people, but unfortunately, if you read these old documents making this SIP, Social Investment Package, you see that there are the economy first and some infrastructural businesses are most important, not people really. My question is if this asset-based approaches is rooted in such policies, yes or not, or something.
I think that's a bit of the debate which we come into a little bit later, because there are some interesting papers available which teases out the dangers of an asset-based approach as to whether it adopts a neoliberal agenda. And obviously the more that a community can look after itself, the less the state has to provide for it. And there's a bit of research which hasn't really taken off the ground as yet in England, and I imagine it's the same in Poland here, is to actually to look at the resources and money that leaves poor communities.
Mm-hmm.
And we were discussing this morning, that that's the money that people in poor communities spend just to live is usually spent outside the very community and environment where they live. So then there's an issue as to how can we, in a sense, keep that money inside that community to grow itself. And this is a complex analysis, because the other thing which we touched again this morning is that the majority of people living in poor communities are usually employed on the basic wages. They're living on benefits, and in a sense, if they spend their money in the outside, then it's actually the poor that are actually keeping the affluent in a comfortable life. Now that's quite a radical notion, isn't it? If we take that view, but it does lead to a question as to whether it's possible to engage in community economic development, where we pay particular attention to developing the local economy in communities. And certainly there are one or two things have emerged from the access to food, fuel and finance that I've said, how do we develop cooperative shops inside poor communities and run these as normal businesses and try to hold some of that resource back into the community. There are many things that actually local people could be supported to organise for themselves at a cost, and certainly I think there's enough evidence, without too biased a view, that places like the Mondragon community in Spain, very, very effective cooperative experience. Maranello community near Seville, I think 90% of the businesses in that local community are owned by that community. It's the will to move in that direction is the problem rather than the resource or the ideas to do it. So some real challenges there. But you want to just take us through a little bit of the process?
Yes, I will. Listen, I'm just going to talk to you about how this is put into practice. Can you hear me, Dominic?
Yes.
Yeah, fine, good. I've used asset-based community development. We should really use it all the time as community development workers. We should always be working from an asset-based approach. The two examples that I can think of at the moment, I'll just say a few words about, and then I'll say a few words about this one that Jim mentioned. But I mentioned earlier using it with small family farmers, and we did quite a lot of work in the Peak District in England, which is one of our national parks. Very beautiful, lovely place, very expensive housing, but full of hill farmers trying to breed sheep in a climate where they just weren't getting the money for selling the meat and the wool, and were living in dire poverty. And we used it with them, and one of the issues that the problem that you get when working with a group of people who are so ground down is that all they look at is their problems. They look at the deficits. They look at the fact that they can't sell the meat for a good price, that they can't afford to mend their equipment, that they can't afford to mend their buildings. They can't afford to buy the feed in for their animals. And what we did was we went in with a different approach and said, can we look at your assets? What have you got? You know, you've got your capital assets, you've got your land, you've got your properties. What human assets have you got within the family? How can you capitalise on those? What assets have you got in terms of natural assets? You know, you've got the wonderful countryside, how can you build on those? And actually getting them to sort of look at what it was they had rather than what it was that they hadn't, and starting to build on that. And a few years ago I used this approach in an urban area near where I live, a very diverse area that suffers multiple deprivation. And they were asked to do what's called a community-led plan. And this is a plan of the area which is supposed to bring out the issues that they can then work on and feed into an action plan. And these have been had happened across the country, mostly in rural areas, and been called parish plans. And now they were being used in urban areas. And it was an urban area that had so much research done. And I thought, if we simply go out and do research with this area and say, what are the problems? We know what the problems are: the crime, the drugs, the prostitution, the litter. It's not a very clean area. We know that. Let's instead turn it on its head, and we employed 3 community researchers to go out and say to people, what are the assets of this area? You know, what are there in terms of people? What are there in terms of buildings? What are there in terms of skills? What are there in terms of community assets? And we pulled together, using a range of exercises, a document which said this is what this area has got, not what this area hasn't got. You know, this is not what the problems are. We know what they are. People have researched them forever. Nothing has ever happened. And we came up with 3 sort of action points, really, that there are lots of young people in the area. There needs to be some work with young people to capitalise on their energy and their skills. Very diverse community. We needed to build on the unity and integration that was needed, and to do more about community safety, especially where racism was concerned. And it was interesting because I got well and truly criticised for this. And I can hold up my hands and defend it. I was not going to take that criticism. But certainly by local councillors, our local elected representatives, said no, we wanted to know what the problems were. We wanted you to go door to door and ask people what's the issues. So that we know those. This way we're actually saying there's something positive about living here. There's something we can build on. And a year or so later, there was some pots of money made available by the government for small amounts of money, up to 2,500 grants. And this area qualified for about 60,000 of this. And we were able to use that report and say, we'll use that as the basis for allocating this money. And so we set up a panel of local people, and we used that report to build on the assets there. So we could go to all these community groups that existed, the musical groups, the sports clubs, the homework clubs, the young people's groups, because we knew where they were then, and say, can you use this money to improve what you're doing for the area, rather than starting from a deficit-based approach and saying, well, what's wrong with it? What should we do to put that right? We could actually work on the assets that the area had. So, as I say, we should be using it in all the work that we do, asset-based work, rather than looking at the minuses. We should always be looking at the pluses. And I think we should always be doing it when we work with people as well, when we do social work. And this is the report that Jim mentioned, Unearthing Hidden Assets, and this talks about 4 areas across the country, in the northeast, in the Midlands, and I think in the southwest as well. And the process that was used here involved universities in those areas, working with statutory bodies and with community organisations and local people to co-design services. And I take what Jim says, that the neoliberal approach can use asset-based work if you're not careful, to say, yeah, we can manage without the statutory services. And in some rural areas where a lot of it's being used, and I do work in areas with community shops, I work with the Plunkett Foundation setting up community shops, mostly in rural areas, where often there aren't statutory services, that people have got to do it themselves. But if we're going to use this in urban areas, then I think we have got to be careful that what we're looking at is using this to co-design services. So this looked particularly at public health and health services, and bringing people together with the universities, with the statutory bodies, and saying, and we talked about this earlier, didn't we, of working with older people and designing older people services, is getting the people involved who are going to use those services and saying, right, what are the issues? Let's design first of all the research question. What's the question we're going to ask? So actually bringing people together, all the partners together, to design that research question, and then using some creative approaches to unearth the hidden assets in those communities, to work on that research question. Yeah. So you'd use a range of tools and methods, and we're going to talk some more about this tomorrow when we're in your conference, and the workshop that we're going to do is to start using some of those tools and methods. So things like collecting stories of success, actually saying to people, what has worked in this community, what's gone well, and is it possible to replicate that? Visioning, getting people together around a table and saying, what is your vision, what's the best that we can possibly do? And community mapping. This is one of the things that we did when we did the community-led plan, was mapping out what there is in a community. We did that with the farmers as well, mapping out what your assets are, so that we know what we're starting with, because you're never starting with a blank sheet in any of these communities. You need to know what's there, and it should be a basic tool of any community worker, is to develop a community map before you start to work, because that's respectful. Getting some discussion and learning going within the groups, listening to and valuing the different views, and there will be different views within any community, there will be, and I'll come back to that. Starting to build relationships between the people who live in those communities, the people who work there, all the different institutions and the social groups, and starting to share the responsibility between the organisations that will be providing the services and the people who live there and work there. And what Jim has put here is a couple of slides showing exactly this happening, really, the groups of people sort of getting together round a table, and next one I think is in somebody's garden, actually starting to share some insights and share some experiences together. Now the next slide is about the skills required. Oh, sorry, you're ahead of me. And the most important skill is facilitation skills. And again, any community development worker ought to be building these skills. And we describe it here as the art of not putting ideas into people's heads, but of drawing ideas out. And the quote I've given here is, a facilitator is best when people barely know that you exist. That you're there, you're starting the process off of people talking, but of drawing those ideas out, getting them documented. Again, one of the biggest tools of our profession is the flip chart and the pen. Getting those down on a flip chart, or getting people to document them in some way, using all sorts of tools and techniques, but being able to stand back and let the discussion flow, really. And then going back to what I said earlier, managing conflict. Wherever you've got any group of people, there will be conflict. There will be different ideas, and that's not a bad thing. You know, I take the Marxian approach that conflict is creative. You know, it's where you get consensus that you get stagnation. You need that conflict to start getting ideas from people. And you need to know how to manage that so that it's constructive and not destructive. So acknowledging it and trying to establish the cause, but also helping people to get to this point of agreement. You know, it may be a matter of compromise, but it's getting people to recognise how both sides, or all sides in some cases, can actually get something out of this process. Building trust and respect between group members and encouraging dialogue, and then encouraging each member of the group to contribute to the best of their ability. So it's those facilitation skills again.
You saw that in the same.
Of course, yeah.
Maybe a concept you'd be interested in. It's that whole notion of what sociologists would call the invited space. Who's inviting who into whose space is absolutely key, important here. And in some respects, from the experience that however hard one tries, if you're a public body, then there's a kind of resistance there in terms of the invitation. And so it is where some of the faith groups, to use a bit of UK jargon, are sometimes perceived as the honest broker in a situation. Not every situation, but in some situations. So the notion of invited space, it is quite important, how you engage and who invites who into whose space. And some of the evidence we gathered for that unearthing the has really highlighted this, because we actually tried to capture people over a 40-year period when they had lived in the community as what did it feel like when people arrived to build that building or that sports hall. People were saying, we actually didn't think it was anything to do with us, but it was being built in their community. And this is, that's how they perceived it. And the other aspect that was amusing, if not sad, was the way that the professionalization of the people who would enter these communities, how this was perceived. So, for example, some women who were volunteers working on a health project were told by a nutritionist that you don't have the responsibility and you shouldn't advise people to eat 5 fruits because that's a nutritionist's job. These women just thought this was crazy, but this was their experience of the professionals arriving in their community. And then they were said it's so stupid that this information was, but you're allowed to tell the people where to buy the vegetables. So this was their perception, and these are people who had moved on and become professionals themselves, and had learned from the thing. They were able to look back and say, this is really crazy that each program that arrived from the municipality or the government was like a new set of rules, and if you conform to these rules, you would get the extra money for your project. But it very rarely had anything really to do with a sense of ownership, of the work. And the incidents we gathered from that, in fact, we actually challenged that whole project because that was a government-inspired project, hugely funded to the universities to research so-called connected communities. That was a government initiative. £200 million was available to universities to run connected communities. In other words, find evidence that there were assets there. But nobody really bothered to go and ask local people. They didn't have access to the £200 million. In fact, the money was being taken from them to pay the university to go and do the research. So we challenged that a little bit by saying we would look at what happened over 40 years and how that had influenced. And one elected member, he's kind of critical of the universities, but he says the university now are very good at going around hoovering up money. So that was a nice expression, you know, that was how he perceived them as an elected member. They were very good at that. And I think my own view was the government had colluded a little bit by trying to sort of get in England a new way to the so-called big society, you know, which was a conservative thought, that you pay the university to discover all these assets and then try to mobilise them. But I think the important part, and we want to say here, that that particular project had people from the university world that wasn't just welfare or sociology, that had people from photographic world, from theatre world, you know, people who were good at animation, and this was often needed for people who were a bit resistant to, you know, to engage in a cerebral way with people. But the animation was so important in some of these projects that it worked. So some challenges there. How well do we link into different bits of the university with, you know, photographic skills or whatever? And the photographer at the project I was in, as soon as you asked anything critical, he said, "It's very dark, isn't it? Very dark." You know, as if I said, "Well, it's just political. It's not that dark." It's just, this was new for him in terms of what he was portraying.
Yes, I think that whole issue of being invited into other people's space is quite
very key.
Very key, yes. You know, I can think of my own village where, you know, people have come in uninvited and done work, and has not built on the assets, the people that are there. And we were talking earlier about television, and how television sometimes takes over poor areas and portrays them in a very negative light. This happened in an estate that I've been working on, a housing estate, a programme called Skint, which is a television programme that looks at people living in poverty, and had really, I think 4 episodes, had really ripped the estate apart in terms of the negatives and the people living on benefit, the people not having jobs, the poverty that they lived in, and really reduced the confidence in that estate. And I've worked with them recently on a goal planning day, and one of the first things, I was invited into their space, into the community centre, and one of the first things I do with them is to say, right, what have you achieved over the last 4 or 5 years? You know, let's get a record of what this organisation has done that's positive, to try to put right that whole deficit-based approach that the television programme has used, because all that did was to reduce the confidence of the people there, and what they needed was to acknowledge that they're actually doing some really impressive work on that estate and doing it themselves in collaboration with others. The research, I think Maria's got the yes, here it is. Let's discuss here in Unearthing Hidden Assets. It's largely around public health. And the case study that I'm going to talk about is one called The Picture of Health. And that brought people together, I think, in Stoke-on-Trent. And they used what Jim has called animation. They used drama to try and bring people together and start to bring out the hidden assets that people have got there. And the questions that they posed there was, could your own local, there's some typographical errors here, but could your own local communities make improvements in your own health? And will your local communities make a difference to health in the next 5 years? And they had 3 workshops, and the 3 exercises that they had within these workshops, they brought people together from different groups. The first group was asked to develop solutions to some local problems, 3 problem-focused community health scenarios. But they were told they could not use the words money, hospital, doctor, nurse, NHS or council in order to solve these health issues. So they were asked to use a social model of health, if you like, rather than the medical model. So turning things around, what can we do within our community to help people become healthier, but without using this medical model of health, of trying to cure people or bring in sort of outside resources. The second one, which was of interest, I think, to yourselves, is creating a virtual healthy community for older people. So how can we provide a community that is healthy for the people who are ageing, and think about the sort of things that will help them, so things that will help to relieve loneliness, that will help to enable them to eat properly and keep safe, and to keep warm, all those sort of issues that have an impact on you in old age. Not necessarily, how you get your tablets prescribed or, how you get your illnesses diagnosed, but how do you try to fend off those issues? And then the third group was asked to tell the world, including government, how they've created great health in their own local communities. And the benefits of using these techniques, they created a level playing field so that everybody involved, the university professors, the statutory bodies, the social workers, the people from public health, they took part on an equal basis. They were able to, everybody was able to give what they knew they could give. And they could explore these issues in a safe environment. And one of the ground rules that I always introduce when I'm doing any exercise of that nature is there is no such thing as a stupid question. And conversely, there is no such thing as a stupid idea. So, what you might be thinking, somebody else in the room is probably also thinking. So do say so, you're safe. Unusual ideas could come out. People could bring out things that they've always thought was perhaps very useful, but hadn't really been able to talk about before. New and unexpected relationships developed between maybe the Director of Public Health and an elderly person who knew what it was like to be lonely. They're adaptable and transferable. All these exercises can be adapted, they can be transferred to different situations, not just public health, but looking at things like social care, looking at things like regeneration, economic regeneration of an area. And lastly, most importantly, they were fun. And people got a lot of pleasure out of doing it. And I think if you're going to use people's time, it's got to be fun. People have got to get something out of it. And the sort of assets that came out that were unearthed, time and interest of community members, that the people who got involved were able to find time to commit to developing some of the projects that came out of this. And they were interested. And I hear an awful lot, and I'm sure a lot of you do, is that people are apathetic. We're all apathetic about things we're not interested in. But if you can key into the things that people are interested in, that people are going to get something out of, people will devote their time and energy to it. And the creativity that came out of this, because it was using drama, the people that got the skills in things like music, poetry, drama, was quite interesting, who probably never had a chance to use them before, or had never been acknowledged before. It also unearthed previously unavailable networks, the people who linked with each other day after day. Just linking into those networks I often find is quite useful because you can build on those and bring about some real change. And previously unavailable information, again, information that people have got locked away in their communities, but the people who are running the services often don't know about. And then finally, just a quote from the professor that was involved in this from Keele University. And she said, "The picture of health activities have challenged my preconceived ideas about health and public health, and I've changed my position about what having a good life means." So I've realised that out there's a lot of intelligence, if you like, in all those communities that she can unearth and build upon to try and bring about a changed picture of health. So on that note, I'll hand back over to Jim to finish off.
This is an interesting place. I think my critique of the Stoke-on-Trent place might obviously say, well, how did you actually then take these ideas forward? And they didn't really. So in some senses, I was a bit impatient, wanted to say, okay, all that learning, how did you actually capture it? And I partly saying the same things this morning with our colleagues that get in your hand, and here today that, okay, I think there's a European Union jargon called valorization. I think that's, you see it in the EU speak, how do you valorize these ideas? How do you take these ideas and take them through the political process? And so I think that, some of the challenges to come out of today is, in what way is it possible, to work together, between the university and an area here just to test out some of these things and drive them into being, and what are the implications for social work training. So I think that's the challenges that are there. Just a few parts that might be useful for working with the students here. That's, you know, this notion of partnership, working on 4 kind of elements. You have to really think about respect, reciprocity, realism, and risk-taking. You know, without respect between the partners, then I think partnerships are really quite difficult if there's no respect there. And certainly in some of the evidence from unearthing hidden assets, there was certainly no respect on many of the professionals for the expertise of local people. That was quite clear, and that was a bit sad. And the other part, again, reciprocity was a huge challenge, and I imagine it's the same here. It's a provocative aspect for the university, you know, who can believe in co-design and co-production. But one of the things they decided at the end of this project was the co-design and the co-production had to happen before the budget was distributed. Because in effect, in a sense, what has actually happened is that the university actors in the situation, you know, had benefited hugely from the assets of the projects, and the local communities, you know, just had a small amount for their activities. So co-design and co-production had to happen before the money was distributed. Otherwise, there's a danger that it wouldn't be evenly managed. Of course, that's a big challenge for practitioners and universities, and the realism and a bit of risk taking. So we come to this part now, which is nearly picking up when we were here, I think last May or whatever it was. You know, how do we generate a kind of environment for critical education? You know, how do we challenge young people that come to university, and how do we challenge this notion of self-interest that might be there? And for those in the university, you might find it interesting to read the work of a sociologist called Danny Dorling, a British sociologist, either at Oxford or Cambridge, and he's looked at aspects of inequality, and he takes us back to the founding of the welfare state in England, that looked at things like ignorance and want and needs, poverty, you know, in the early days 40 years ago. But some of his present day analysis has come out with a different set of ideas that are really quite challenging, because he says we're living in a society that actually thinks that elitism is efficient. So we live in a society where elitism is efficient, and that's quite a kind of challenge. So what is in the mind of students when they come to university? You know, is this a pathway to join the elite? Or is it a pathway to identify the needs at another kind of level? So he's challenging us on that notion. Elitism is efficient, and you think through the media that if you don't pay the big money, you don't get the best person for the job. Says who? Yeah, where does that notion come from? So you see what the notion of elitism is a way that society, and we've got the bankers, of course, you know, we're on the bonuses, even though we've made a loss, we're still entitled to a bonus, you know. So in a sense, that's kind of complex. This elitism is a fix. So Danny Dorling's, he's saying to us, exclusion is necessary. There's another quite challenging thing for us to deal with. Exclusion is necessary. It's necessary to have these poor communities to keep the people who are not able to work or whatever. So exclusion is necessary. He challenges us saying prejudice is good. So you see, so it's come up a few things that are asking us to to the very framework of ideas that sustain inequality. He frames in his book called Inequality. So it's quite important notion of critical education, how we help people to deal with that, engage with that. And I think, as we discovered at the last time at the seminar here, for example, other departments in a university had a responsibility for this. And I recollect on a day that a lecturer from the law department, as far as they were concerned, everything was cut and dried. The law department, all these modules to do, it was quite clear. And so we said, well, how do you educate law students to deal with gender issues? Or how do you educate law students to deal with migration issues? And how do you help people tease through these issues so that when they're engaging in cases, that's where the real meat comes in to being able to apply the law. And I think it seemed quite a new idea that you had critical practice could be part of law, and we needed lawyers, but we needed lawyers that saw things slightly from a different angle. And we see what's happening in America and the new film Selma. If you see that some of these race issues are just as prevalent today in America as when Martin Luther King was there. So community development, Poland, lessons from the past. Where have things been at? And there's been a lot of interesting work done in the communities in Warsaw. How some of your projects are quite key, picking up many of these ideas of asset-based developments. How do they engage with an area that perhaps perceives itself as more affluent, perceives itself as more joining the mainstream of Gdansk and Gdynia's like that. So I'm interested in your comments on that. Very, very quickly, for a long time, how do we embrace some of these, I'm calling them contestable concepts? Community development is essentially a contestable concept. People should be fair, people should be equal, people should have some kind of notion of being fair and giving a life to each other's empowerment, participation. What does it mean? And I suppose my belief is that every piece of research a university does should justify why they don't use peer researchers. Why not? So, is any research ever complete if it doesn't contain people who are being researched in the process? So, is information partial? Democracy and justice are intrinsically linked. Dialogue and dissent. Do we encourage dissent? Is that okay to do that? Freedom and diversity. So some ideas that I'm sure appear in your program. And bottom lines for community development. People here know about concern for social justice, promote participation, advocate equality, learning from each other, cooperation and collaboration. How are these perceived, and what are the challenges that this approach brings to just the way that things are done? Do these ideas bring challenges to the university table? I suppose we were discussing the last time we're here, and how do we tease through these things? And some of the things that the English Standard Board tries to do when we go to accredit programs in England, he said, well, how do you deal with these issues? How do you help students deal with these challenges and work through these? And very close to Anne's thing there, just moving us on. Just repeat some of the things that Anne was saying. Is there any notion of transformational practice? Is that about that? How can we be flexible without losing focus? How do we include the views of the oppressed individuals and groups? Is theoretically and theologically informed in terms of values of justice and dignity. May challenge existing ideas. Can we look at the nature of organizational culture, whatever? And lastly, the critical analysis of the issues of power, both personal and structural. And I suppose one's political biases as to whether the state should provide any resources for companies that the notion of social value is not the bottom line. You know, is there social value in what's happening? And certainly in the UK, there's many things which sits to the benefit of the provider, not to the society. So sorry that's taken a long time, but I hope it makes sense. I welcome any critique that you have to say. Thank you for listening.
And any questions?
We really have time. If you like to add something, please do it. If not, we will open the
I
discussion.
suppose without questions really as to whether this is an opportune time for community development in Poland. Is this an opportune time? Is that a good time to be involved in these things? And is it possible to get one or two tangible ways that we can make a start and use some of the insights from each other, to go forward on? Because I think those of us who traditionally have linked to countries like Finland and Poland and other things, is that you have many things here that we've got much to learn from in terms of public attitudes, which has been certainly the rollback of the state in England, isn't it? It's quite a serious issue in terms of no state control or sense of. Is that a good time?
Yeah. Thank you very, very much for your presentation. It was very influential for all of us, it seems to me. And please let me do something that I should had to do at the beginning of our seminar. I didn't ask you about your acceptance of the camera working here.
Martin had already
I've
asked
already
us.
done it.
Okay. So Marcin's idea is to use this camera for dissemination of our work here. So all the seminars organized by our Department of Social Pedagogy are on Facebook now. So thanks to Marcin, we are more popular. It's important, really. So the floor is open for discussion. Patricia Uwaga joined us. Patricia, please introduce yourself, just for a minute for you.
So I'm a doctorand of Professor Maria Mendel, and I'm interested in a community of parents of autistic children and how they self-organized and how they build a
Community.
community and support group, and in the small village and countryside.
In the rural area. She's working very efficiently in the Kashubian country around our three cities. Thank you.
So are you working in that context now?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I also work with the autistic children and their parents in my my work.
Thank you.
Patricia, it would be too long to present again ourselves, so please let us continue. The team is composed of people from Gdynia Municipality Center of Welfare, and you know some people from there, and our guest from Warsaw. Not guest, just co-worker, so to speak, Paweł Jordan from CAL, you know CAL. And something else I should tell you at the beginning. Yes, it is the information, very important information for all of you, and also invitation that after our discussion you all are cordially invited to have dinner together at Four Seasons restaurant. So you are our guest, you are my guest as well, so please join us for this dinner. And floor is open for discussion after this inspiring presentation. It seems to me we have some comments, questions, and perhaps suggestions regarding Polish reality, and especially University of Gdańsk ways of teaching of prospective community worker towards community development. Marcin,
Yeah,
something
I
about
have a
this?
question. It's not so local. I want to start from the global point of view.
Yeah.
And if you look, thank you very much. If you look from the global perspective, then you would say from Gramsci perspective, which is, I think you were using some of ideas of Freire and Gramsci. This is the critical way of looking. I would like to ask you, do you see any dangers? Isn't it endangered by this global neoliberal perspective? Because the way you think about community, I would call it, I'm not sure if it's properly, if it properly expresses the English term, it's so-called self-help paradigm. So if you look so you don't need money.
Yes.
You can solve your
can
own
survive
problems. So
by
you don't have
yourself.
money for it. From my point
It's
of
a
view,
very dangerous
the
approach,
redistribution is one of the most important things when you think. So do you see this dangerous situation in which you could be this way of so I know it works, and I believe you, it's really wonderful thing, but it's endangered by this neoliberal discourse which says, okay, you have your own assets, you don't have to think in terms of redistributions, you can solve your own problems, so solve them.
I think that's always been a contradiction in community development, quite honestly, that it can be favoured by both the right and the left. So I think that's always been an issue. And I think it's going back to what I said about using it for co-designing services. I think that if it can be used to encourage statutory bodies to say, rather than us bounce into a community and say, this is what we're going to do for you, as has happened in so many communities that we all know, including my own, and then we all say, well, we didn't want that, that wasn't what we asked for. This is actually about people working with those people in those communities, and tapping into their strengths to say, right, help us to design what we should be doing. So we have got this money to spend in your community, and that one I talked about, that had been the feature of a television programme, there is money to be spent there, but they're now learning that they've got to work with the residents in designing that. So I think if it's used in that way, then I think it's fine. I think it, but I think there is a danger, as you say, of saying, well, okay, we've got, you've got all those assets, why do you need this government money? And I think there is a danger of that. In rural areas where I've worked, then quite often there isn't the government money anyway. If you want a playing field, you've got to provide it yourself. If you want a village hall, you've got to provide it yourself. So I think that's a very different context there. Quite often, you are working in a way that does have to manage without government money. And if you're going to develop resilience, and I think that's the other thing at the moment, is that quite often there isn't government money. If you want to develop resilience, you've got to find those strengths to build on to do so. But I think you're absolutely right. I think there are dangers, and
unless, of course, we address the some of the aspects that are locked into your question there, in that globalization has diminished the manufacturing trades of places like Poland and the northeast of England. And people have invested, in our case, in the Far East, the northeast. And in some ways, I don't have of detailed information about how government resources are distributed in Poland, but I would make some assumptions that the resources which Poland receives from the EU are actually distributed by bodies that are not elected, the money that is actually corralled by power and business, and they produce the business that produces the money for their interests. That's how it works in the UK. And in some respects, we enjoy European social funds. I suppose you come from yourself, and I read the script, and it says 20% of the funds should be spent on social inclusion. I say, well, why not 100% spent on social inclusion? You're trying to say, so what's happened to the 80%? Because there's no accountability. There's no accountability, for those who are spending the 80%. And they're producing companies and businesses, and you can see it around here just by looking around, that have no interest. So there's a question we didn't ask here, but I'm trying to run some seminars over the next few months as to whether we think that the economy is there to serve the people, or are the people there to serve the economy? And that's a big question. Are people there to serve the economy, or the economy there to serve the people? So you understand what I'm asking there. And I don't suppose the Poland situation is so much different from the England situation. So as to whether we develop businesses, that actually are designed, to serve the people. There is a debate which is reasonably well advanced in Scotland. It's called a citizen's wage. I don't know whether you've come across it myself, but you put it into Google. It's called a citizen's wage, which means society will decide how much a person needs to live reasonably well. And society will pay everyone that wage, which has nothing to do with benefits, it's nothing to do with labour, it's nothing to do with the market, it's to do with just society thinks that people have a right to live and to eat and to live a reasonable, dignified life. A citizen's wage. And society's money is divided on that. You understand what I'm saying? Now that then completely undermines all of the world of sanctions, all of the world of stigma, all of the world of incentives that if you don't work, you don't live, what I'm trying to say here, which has been predominated right through the society. So that's the direction, at least in Scotland, is moving to talk about the citizen's wage, which is not anything to do with the labour market. And it means that society has to decide what is going to be necessary to eat and to live at a reasonable level. So you can see the direction I'm trying to travel is that there are assets that these poor communities don't have access to, which in my political view, biased view, that are their assets, which are unfairly and unjustly don't arrive in these communities because they've been captured, by the powerful. If that makes sense. And attended a seminar quite recently, just the day before the elections in Greece. Now that's an interesting case example of global economics, if you wish to look at it that way. And those of us who come from a faith tradition can look at theologically some of these issues and the notion of debt and indebtedness and the Jubilee and all these notions that are there, where in a sense the debts were written off, because really the debts that Greeks have are to people who have money, who've loaned their money to make a profit. That's what I'm trying to say. So it's immediately challenging this notion of theologically coming at the indebtedness as a notion. And it's interesting the way that Greece has had to negotiate a continuation position, isn't it? And who is it that Mrs. Merkel is really defending here? What is she defending? Because the theorists can say that we all have comfort in the law. The law says that you make a deal, a contract, you keep to it. Well, who makes these laws? Who constructs these laws? And can these laws be challenged? And that's what Greece is actually managing to challenge these laws on a global issue. And globally, I think that society is worried about what's happening in Spain. Because in Spain, you have the indignados. These are people on the streets of Spain that who perceive that their dignity, has been taken away. The indignados, the very name expresses that. And they've converted the indignados as a social movement into a political movement. Pomedos, I think they call them. Pomedos, and they've never got seats. And they're actually worried in Spain if there's an election tomorrow that they would win. So I'm trying to say, so there is a movement internationally that's seeing assets slightly different. Does that make sense? So it's nothing to do with welfare or sort of poor people. It's how do we perceive ourselves in community development as part of a movement or as part of a service provision? And I think that's a challenge for us to tease out. And clearly, there's a movement in Scotland at the present time. Certainly a movement there. 86% turned out at the election. So there's a movement that says, okay, we might have to reorganise our taxes, reorganise our way of thinking so that people can have a reasonable way of life. If we're tagged on to England, we'll never achieve that. I mean, it's not a nationalistic view, it's a social, economic perspective. Does that make sense? So I think you're right in saying that, but what does that mean in the northeast of England? It's quite hard to challenge these perspectives, but I do think that's the commitment that community development has to make and come up with real advantages. And I was interested in your aspect of the village, and I'll give you the link afterwards. There's a place near Seville called Maranelda, and it's a village of about 4,000 people, or slightly less. And the village works totally as owned by the people who live there. And the deal there is that you don't go and live there if you don't want to be involved in living in a cooperative. And it's not a communist thing, it's just a way of saying it. It's not a communist thing. And 15 euros a month to have a house, but you have to give 300 hours to help build it. I went to see it last year and really impressed by the whole notion, the way that Maranelda worked as a notion. And interestingly, there's a small community, marginalised, poor community in Glasgow, and I was telling this story, and they were saying to me, but we're a village. They perceived themselves living in the city of Glasgow as in a village because they were excluded. So the question as to whether people in Gdynia and some of these 3 or 4 communities, do they see themselves as being excluded? The Glasgow people say, we see ourselves as village, we should be doing much more things for ourselves. And that's where the community shop, I don't mean a food bank, I mean a proper, normal community shop that's a business and run as a business. And thankfully there's a glimmer of the cooperative movement in England through Plunkett and people willing to fund that. So there's a little bit of a glimmer, but it's contestable. I mean, we know it's going to be contestable. We're not going to get society to agree with that, is it? No, it's quite hard. I don't know whether that answers your thing, but I think it's possible to see it globally and go for it.
Thank you.
Sorry, your colleague had gone, because I was hoping to ask it. I think that there was a time before last when we were here that I suppose I had some imagination that might be possible to have some university kind of practice expression in a community where some people of yourselves work there for part of the week, doing research and very much hands-on research, working with local practitioners, beginning to explore these aspects I'm talking about, movement of money and deprivation, and whether that was a focal point for students learning as well, whether that could work. It's like an action-based research methodology. Is that beyond possibility completely, or worth thinking about, or is it happening already that could be done?
This is our approach here, because there are roots of such actions in university education of community workers and social pedagogues as well. The roots are taken from first of all Helena Radlińska's thought, and this thought is about exactly hidden and not hidden assets that are able to be unearthed and fostered as well by social pedagogues, social workers. And she taught us also, she's classic for all of us, classic thinker for all of us, but we are still feel under her influence, very important influence, especially by her methodological approach called life observations. In Polish, wżywanie. We know this approach, this method. This life observation means being still the animator, the researcher, but deeply inside the community. This means that by all your sensual possibilities, you are taking all the information from local community, from all the signs of hidden and not hidden assets. So that's why I said that we do such action research and research-based activities in local communities here with our students by themselves as well, in cooperation with centers such as Jarek's center and others. But it seems to me that we all are feeling very much involved in your way of thinking after this presentation, because we see some new ideas and especially very important critical aspects of such approaches. I mean, this Radlińska's like approaches in our work. However, your workshops, these 3 workshops that you described, this is very, very inspiring for us. Critical approach present in the questions that you, Jim, articulated. For example, talking about the notion of inviting space, you gave us the example of questions such as who is inviting, who is invited. This is fantastic, really. Or the last one, elitism is efficient. Yeah. Exclusion is necessary. There are not the questions exactly, but this is something like very hot statement that makes all of us involved in thinking about social justice, democracy, and etc. etc. So thank you very much for this your excellent work that made us deepen more involved in critical approaches to our work. of course, we know Freire, we know emancipatory directions in social pedagogy and social work as well. But in my opinion, in Poland, we have still some problem with understanding of what's going on under umbrella of critical pedagogy, really, because many of pedagogues, even those who declare that they are doing critical pedagogy, they don't understand that critical pedagogy means social activism, socially involved performance. This is acting, first of all. So that's why I said that we are people in this room, but also in Poland, we really appreciate such impulses of development of our self, of our approaches to university education of prospective social workers, community workers.
I think the thing we might like say something here that when we're interested in how people pick up any of these aspects, you know, at the workshop tomorrow, and in a sense the question is how would they like to proceed as from tomorrow in terms of a way forward. So we actually touch the invited space issue as from tomorrow, because in some sense if people tomorrow say, well, how can we continue this discussion, then that would be a very productive question to come from the workshop tomorrow. How can we continue the discussion? So we have to address the issue as what might happen next, what would we like to happen next from the workshop, and how can we pursue some of these ideas. And in some ways, I mean, ideally, maybe something might come through tomorrow that says, well, can we invite the university to help us? So I'm trying to say that's the invited space notion. So that's then the challenge of where it might actually go next. But I think as this little project highlighted, that can't solve everything overnight, obviously, and there is the potential of maybe trying to take some area or some locality and say, let's test out some of the ideas and see where they get to, and see whether we can learn from it. And that's where yourselves might be able to help, and we could look at the kind of resources that might be available, from Erasmus Plus or some other European sources to take a step forward. And there are other resources coming from Europe under the notion of health equity. I don't know whether you've had a look at these, but health equity is actually quite an important source of funding, which is slightly different from Erasmus Plus again, because they're concerned that if we don't act now, in 20 or 30 years' time, the incidence of ill health will just be growing up. And so I think Europe recognises we've got to act now before things get any worse. So I think there are possibilities, if we can get an imaginative programme there, to genuinely take something forward. And I mean, this was actually quite a simple piece of research, really, but the outcome of that was that the leader of Glasgow City Council and the leader of Edinburgh City Council put out a joint statement agreeing to support all of the recommendations. Now, it was quite simple that these two leaders, I think it might even be the first time in history that the leaders of the two city councils actually agreed in principle. Whether they signed it without reading the recommendations is another matter, but at least we can now hold them accountable to say, oh, you said you would agree with these recommendations. Where do we go next? So, what I'm trying to say, so all of these are political moments, aren't they? Political moments, and they bother to say that food is not, shouldn't be begged for we should get away with food banks. And there are thousands of food banks in England, charitable food banks. Even the local authority stores the food for the food banks. You know, so you've institutionalized poverty, you know, which is real indictments on the system in England. And of course, that's a challenge to us, you know, who say, well, how do we come out of that in a positive way with something that's meaningful, and we can grow from there. And so the two leaders, having said that's great for us, and in a supportive way, we'll say, okay, can we sit down with you now to say, how can that go forward? And it's how do you get to that political point? Anyway, thanks very much for the chance to continue the debate.
Does anybody else want to ask any questions?
I've got one more.
Oh, good.
I think the idea you were talking about, I would call it decommodification. Am I right?
Yeah,
It's
basically
something that is opposite to commodification. So I would like you to ask you: is it a strong debate about decommodification of some of services, some of things? Because you mentioned food shouldn't be dependent on whether you have money or not. Your Britain has, UK has a public health system, so which is a great idea, I think, in general. We in Poland we have mixed system, so it's a little bit private. It's in some ways it's private, in some ways it's public. And is it a strong debate about decommodification in Britain, like in UK? I'm sorry, you're from Scotland. I'm sorry.
I think what's happening is commodification, certainly of health. That has been a right since 1948.
Yeah.
And what we're getting now is commodification as it goes out to tender. So you've got Virgin Healthcare running our scanning services in our local hospital suddenly. They run our sexual health services, would you believe? So suddenly it's become commodified. You know, it's become something that people buy. People are becoming consumers rather than patients. So although they're not actually paying directly at the moment, you can see that it's becoming a commodity that we're selling to Virgin Health or Bupa or whoever to provide, instead of us actually sort of employing the radiographers and the nurses. So I think that's happening with other services as well. That commodification is becoming something that's bought instead of that's a service as of right.
But it's whether people have the incentive, the support, the encouragement to do something different and in a very simplistic way. And it's a thing for in terms of work with older people that
social care.
That's, I mean, my experience of living in kind of partly in a working community is the thing that people were good at was looking after other people, you know, whether it was cleaning or doing that, that's the norm. And in a sense, I don't see any problem looking ahead that in every community, why isn't it a caring establishment run by local people? And we train people to run it in their own community. Why is there not a hospice where required run by local people in their community? I think, and they would be, you know, you would be buying services from local people. And that's not then to do for yourself, that's a different change of the economy. Because there are people lurking around who are picking up these jobs, you know, privatizing for kind of profit. And it's local people having the confidence to think in that way. And there are good examples around England where, you know, where people are running their own affairs. And I don't know so much in England, but I know in Scotland that people are actually running their own wind farms in Scotland. You know, generating their own power. As collective, as communities. So they're getting their own electricity. So we're not talking just about welfare, we're talking about basic kind of needs where they've had to get together to run these. So do we see it in that way? Is that the way that we see it? That you know, we're energizing people to do these things. So there's quite a lot of good examples of local people being encouraged to you know, to take that pathway. The task is how do you convince people, you know, that you know, to go that way and to see it that way, not least in the health world, where there's a huge amount of resource in England just now to encourage sport-related activities or cycling activities or things that generate health. Some of these could be organised and run by local people with a bit of support, a bit of encouragement. And I know one area where they're working with the university to develop it's like a social businesses resource centre in a poor community where it will work with local people and take on some of the initial management to do the books and to run it. Now that to me is quite creative. It's a different model, but care world is a world of people who've got natural skills because that's the tradition of working in these establishments, isn't it? So I think that there are ways that we could rethink that. Certainly I think probably there's more tradition in your country than in England of that happening. It's how do we link into that and make it work for us here? Whether there's a climate for that is another matter. Whether it happens in a village or not.
I think it should be a part of curriculum, simply students' curriculum, because
I do, yeah.
I was trying to implement that, and they would say, "Wow," because they think in a very the young people today in Poland, they are very inspired by liberal thinkers. So if I introduce some ideas about welfare states, well, they are stealing my money because I have to pay taxes. Yeah, this is, I think, all the
elitism is efficient.
This is what I do. I say, you are here for free because you're studying for free. You didn't pay for it. Who paid that? We all pay. So they, oh my God, yeah, this is okay. Paying taxes is okay then. Yeah.
But that's where Danny Darling is exactly correct. What you're experiencing, that people believe they don't that. You come here because you can join the elite. I mean, that's what Darling is saying, that's a profound example of what you're saying there, and it's effective, because you get a living, and so you're right, and that's quite complex, isn't it? But I think there's
it's a very, very radical idea, though, that it should be on the curriculum, because that's really challenging the status quo, isn't it?
Oh yeah, in this way, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
radical. Yes.
Easy work.
Yeah.
May I just share one example? I'm not from the field, but I'm take part in, I would say, social movement in my village. I mean, by hearing what you are saying about your country, I find something in my village. It's quite small, but a couple of years ago, and it still is, we have problems with kindergartens.
Kindergarten.
Yeah, and there are not enough places, of course. So it was about 5 years ago. Parents from my village, they started to discussing this. Okay, what should be done? Our children have no opportunities really to prepare before going to school.
Right.
So and there was first idea of creating playing groups. And it was very important that no one comes from the authorities and say, do it here, and you do it. It had to be done in the way that there's a secret agent, in the library, encouraging the library director, or maybe something could be done in this place, it's a library. But because the lady is older and she is very powerful in the village, she could not really do that. So she asked a girl, and she's her mother-in-law. So the girl, having friends at the same age, started encouraging her friends. And that's how it developed. And now we have 3 or 4 playing groups in the village, side villages. We meet like every Monday with our kids. And you mentioned that it's like the first question, what skills do we have? What could be done? But it was also a question, who do we know?
Yes.
Because if her mom-in-law, was a director of the place, she could leave the keys so we could stay longer. Another friend's father had a factory and he could produce some kind of decoration that kids could paint, and so on and so forth. And now it works really, really efficient, but the thing is, we had to start with something. I mean, there was a place, plus the lady from the library, she tried to get some big educational toys from the Communist project, Communist Foundation. So it was a very beginning, but then really it's like our sources, and we don't feel really pressured that something has to be done because no one is paid, and we all feel that there are lots of advantages because our kids are involved. And now after 5 years, it's changing the way that parents shall meet once a month or twice a month. We have a meeting tomorrow with sexuologists or psychologists talking about how we should introduce subjects connected with gender in the family. So it started with the lack of kindergarten, and now it transformed in the way that, you know, it's just going, and no pressure. I mean, I couldn't go yesterday, I didn't feel well, so my husband went, and I mean, he doesn't need to have any skills like, I know, teaching them English. It's enough when he's there and, you know, just have fun. So it works. I mean, it works, but it has to go like from the down and be very, very gentle without any pressure.
That's an excellent example. I mean, you're saying exactly what we're saying, that we just believe that in every community that it's like that. And I suppose I would make some assumptions that some of the families involved all have enough basic resources to, you know, to eat and not be under too much stress. And that's my assumption. The people that you've talked about, you know, it's in the poorer areas. If people are just under so much stress, you know, in terms of having enough just to live basically on, that it's very difficult to, to do that. And one of our schemes of recognition, of recognizing people who practice, and one woman, I thought she was brilliant, because we said, well, if you do this and you do this, you'll get this award in 6 months' time. And she just said to him, if I could look ahead 6 months with any kind of security, I'd be in heaven, she said. She says, I don't know. The idea that in 6 months' time I'll have any idea that I'm coping is just beyond, you know. So that was the reality of her, and she was clever enough and confident enough to say that to us, you know. You assume that my life is not just stressful every day, you know, just surviving, isn't it?
Having said that, but
It's a brilliant example.
Women being part of your group, you know, in that situation could actually be a saving of them, you know, because they're starting to develop networks and friendships and support. So it can have that impact as well.
But the work aspect is also key, and the trade unions in the northeast of England are very interested in how the casualisation of labour, you know, of women having to take jobs that are below capacity, and we have systems of zero contracts and, you know, low pay, and some of that is another set of issues that need to be addressed. But your examples are perfect, and
I mean, it doesn't work from the very beginning, like, you know, very good group, but after a couple of years, we started talking. There was one girl, she was unemployed for 4 years, and finally it turned out there's a, you know, free place in my school, so she could go there because I had the information. So I mean that finally there are things that work also connected with work and so on, but it's a very long process. I mean, it's not like this. So
no. If you listen to music, have you come across what's called the Venezuelan Youth Orchestra? Have you ever heard of that?
yeah, the parents. Yeah.
You heard of that?
Yes.
Venezuelan Youth Orchestra, and that's one of the things that turned my head a number of years ago. And apparently, about 15 years ago in Venezuela, said all of the educational system would actually work towards equipping people to understand music, to play music, to appreciate music, to make instruments, to do all these things. Venezuela did that. 15 years on, they've got the youth orchestra that's doing that. Now, the interesting thing for me is that a friend of mine from Edinburgh, a churchman, went to Venezuela, and we have 2 of these projects in Scotland, designed in the most impoverished areas, one in Raploch and Stirling and one in Govan Hill. An interesting thing that just before the Olympics, it's on YouTube, you can follow it, the Venezuelan Youth Orchestra came and played with kids on a poor area of Scotland on a stage, you know, pre the Olympics, and you're doing kind of tough, kind of Scottish children, you know, 8-year-olds who were saying to the cameras, "Yeah, I thought about the trombone, but I really like the trumpet best, and I really play a clarinet. What do you play?" And some kids were speaking to the cameras in these terms, and of course the organisers were saying that these kids are demanded that the parents take them to the practices, and demanded that the parents take them to the concerts, and that's the switch that has happened in these areas. That the investment in the children in that area has really, they've turned their own parents around, you know, because they've been so inspired to play, you know, the instruments. When I saw their activity film, they were making violins out of cardboard. And I said, that's a bit stupid. What are you doing making violins? But it's the whole way of inducting the children into understanding the instrument that they actually play, understanding the instrument by making it in cardboard. And what does it do? And, you know, so the animation, you know, was brilliant. And there's a new project near where I live with unemployed people. And the theory of the person who organised it was, why should people in our area buy cheap ukuleles from China? You know, ukulele instrument. So he then got money from the pensions people for 6 people in a project to learn how to make guitars and ukuleles. So he's actually got, you know, unemployed making the instruments. That, I think that you don't need to be too clever to say that 6 people make guitars and ukuleles. 2 of the people will end up wanting to play it. You can just about guarantee that. You don't make an instrument without wanting to play it. So the 6, you'll get 2 musicians will come out of the thing. So you can see how that shifts is quite important. That was another very interesting idea that recently someone just said, you know, we'll start to make something, you know, like that. And I thought that was quite a good project. And that's quite new in our area. And we're trying to sort of develop social enterprise into, you know, things of that nature. So there's room. It's an extension of your kind of project into another realm. So that we can try that next.
Yeah, absolutely. Ola said that she's not very much involved in our topic today, but it's not exactly true, because your deaf education is community education. It's not exactly or not only school education. This is community-like education. It seems to me it's time to go to the end of our seminar. There are some last comments, questions.
I'm curious, what do you think about lessons learned in Poland from community development?
He feels
Do you
tired.
have any ideas? Because you are, I perceive you as someone who had a large image scale on Poland, and maybe you have some thoughts on it during all those years. What happened? What is really important? What has happened?
I think consistent is important.
Yeah.
To follow it. Okay, that's a broad topic, very broad topic. I don't know if we have
Time for it.
yeah. I think from my point of view, the challenge, but also advantage is that we have more and more people involved in this way of thinking in Poland, from academic world, also practitioners, as well animators, some people, the local level that are involved in citizen activities. Sometimes they don't know they do community work, but doesn't matter. But I think we have more and more network, interconnected network people that they really believe on this. And I think this is the very important aspect from my point of view, looking on 20 years of thinking about it. We can talk tomorrow also.
We are still talking about the time which is going so fast, 20, 25 years of your work. Boris is 25 years old.
92.
One of the first NGO in Poland. Paweł is the leader and so to speak, veteran of this movement, really. I'm sorry, Paweł, I'm such veteran too.
Call us dinosaurs.
Dinosaurs. Yeah, you are dinosaurs. Anyway, I'm sorry, but I make our seminar a little bit longer, but I have one perhaps important question about school, especially public school, in the light, in the context of our today talk about community development. First of all, several months ago, we had a seminar here organized by doctoral students and the Department of Social Pedagogy. It was a seminar titled Public School Means What Exactly? What is this exactly? In the light of this overwhelming neoliberal trend, appeal of diversification of education, of this education sector. In Poland, we have a very similar tendency that you have in the UK under umbrella of diversification too. For example, academias and studios, etc. No school longer, just academias instead of school, of public school. What this means in the context of local communities, life of local communities, welfare, of community development.
I think it probably goes back to what Marcin was saying about commodification, so education is becoming commodified as well, and that most of the academies are owned by some very big businesses, sometimes by faith organisations, but mostly private businesses, and some of them are quite heavily faith-based.
But they are financed from central budget, state budget, in 99%, 1% from the sponsors, and they are called private.
Private?
How is this possible?
It's one of the contradictions of the way in which our government's running it. Things are privatised but paid for by the government, so our taxation is going to pay
Can you
private
imagine this
providers.
paradox?
Well, sadly we have it. We don't have to imagine it.
But
It's there. We have it.
it's back to the money and the economics again. And if you think of all of the things which a school has to purchase to exist, the teachers and the staff, that's paid for by government grants, and the procurement of the school for pencils, for papers, for books, all of the things that a school needs to these are purchased substantially from the governors who sit round the table and their companies. So that is the rather more sinister part of the privatization of the school, away from local authority control. So they're very much a source of income, for the companies and the big business that sits around the table, including some of the faith groups. May I say they play quite a big role in that. So, but we've had a long tradition of that kind of behaviour in England, and some of the original private schools in England enjoyed charitable status.
Like
So
charters
in early days enjoyed charitable status, which meant that the private schools originally didn't have to pay any rates and taxes on the basis that they were charities.
Still don't.
So you can see it was another way of people being selective. But elitism, go back to Dorling's. That's why his ideas are so searching, really, because the academy is an elite, isn't it? And it sounds fine that it's very important that we provide the opportunities to nurture these very able children. You know, you can see it, isn't it? The public response to that. It's a strong narrative, it's a strong message, but in a sense, it's at the expense of poorer children, poorer areas.
And our boards of governors in ordinary publicly funded schools are drawn from staff, from parents, from local community. But the boards of governors on these academies are much more likely to be local business people.
But anyway, they don't tell you in the academies that you'll end up working in McDonald's. Well, that's okay. The fact that our graduates who work at McDonald's is things in England, because I mean the jobs are quite difficult, and I mean my son is roughly the age of the younger ones here, and I mean they can't look more than 3 years on in terms of a job. You know, and that's a long time now in England. You've got a contract for 3 years. So if you imagine a mortgage and a family and children, and it's a very stressful existence, you know, for younger people, and that's the kind of environment we've constructed. Whereas, you know, relatively speaking, people around my age, like 100, you know, they still are living in a previous time when things are certainly more protected. But that doesn't. That's a big change. And I just assume that change will happen if it's not already happening across Europe. And friends I have in America, I couldn't believe that. I mean, they get very. The employment market is very strict in America. So I mean, even quite people high up in the company. So a new person working 2 weeks holiday per year, very tightly, and not much flexibility to that. And coming to visit relatives in England, and the man had to leave a day earlier because he had to get back to his work. We're talking about managers, you know, we're not talking about. So American markets be quite a strict market, as I understand it.
Does that answer your question?
The academies are
so interesting exchange of thoughts. So I think I have my answer for my question, although it is very complicated to answer.
It is for the people who live there, I can assure you.
There is still huge important question about the welfare of local communities, welfare state, quality of people's life, without really public school as the heart of the local community, because sponsored school doesn't mean open community school.
No.
Of course, at the beginning, perhaps it looks like, for example, our case, so to speak, Kokoszki. At the beginning, this school, which is on the way to privatization, because this is a huge building with swimming pool, etc., etc., built basing on local government, our money. And the school is run by a non-governmental organization. And as people representing this school and local authority said, it is an open school with no fees, no charge from parents, etc. And this is school very open for local community forms of their activism, their performances. But this is at the beginning. Nobody knows what will happen in even nearest future, because there is always this drive to making something which is public private.
Yeah.
Even today we had a good example of this Eva Romanov's experience experience case. It was very, very significant in the light of our discussion. It doesn't matter. So let's continue our discussion on the way to the restaurant. 4 pory roku, 4 seasons. It will be our pleasure to have all of you at this restaurant for having this dinner. Thank you. So we are going to there is a table reserved for us. No?
No,
No, we will try to
but
get.
probably they have some free space.
Hopefully
Yeah.
so. So I have a car. So I think 4 people